My name is Milan, and I will be talking about adoption of security capabilities of Prisma Access first. I would like to start with the cyber attack lifecycle. The cyber attack lifecycle is a framework that's used to enhance visibility into an attack and improve our understanding of adversaries' tactics, techniques, and procedures. This specific framework was created by Lockheed Martin engineers all the way back in 2011. And it's definitely not the only framework out there. There are many other ones, for example, MITRE ATT&CK and a plethora of other ones. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we'll be looking at the Lockheed Martin version. The purpose from our point of view in here is to block our adversaries, and blocking them at any point in this cycle will break the chain of attack. So let's dig into it. The first step that every attack starts with is reconnaissance. And just like burglars and thieves, the attackers will always carefully plan their attack. That starts typically with researching, identifying and selecting their targets. Sometimes they could be using phishing or trying to extract public information from different public sources. That could be LinkedIn, Facebook, or even the corporate website. You might think what's interesting on LinkedIn or Facebook, but for example, you can think about a job posting that's very common on LinkedIn. For example, for a job in IT or in security, which lists a required or desired experience with a particular technology or a particular vendor, maybe even for security. And for example, just that gives attackers a good insight into what sort of technologies the potential victim is using to protect themselves. Also gives them the names, the contacts of people responsible for different roles inside the organization, including IT and security, but not just IT and security, any other one. So there's a lot of public information out there that they can gather. Obviously, it can be as simple as looking up the basic information about the company and just looking up which IP address blocks they own. So sort of setting up the targets for further reconnaissance. Once they select the target, that's probably the next step. So finding out which IPs are used by the company, and then scanning them for open IPs, open ports, and if there's any open ports, searching for what type of services or applications are running on those ports, and then if they might be vulnerable to some vulnerabilities they could exploit. So how do we prevent this step? From Prisma Access point of view, we can't do a whole lot about the open source intelligence, so to speak, so about the public information that's available outside of the network. But we can interfere with phishing, right? So if the attackers would scavenge some contacts from the internet and try to send some phishing emails, we can block any access to these malicious URLs using URL filtering. And then also during the reconnaissance phase, once they start scanning for different vulnerabilities, we can detect and prevent these attempts using vulnerability protection. The next step, the attacker needs to determine which methods they want to use. This can really be a whole different spectrum of types of attacks. If they find the vulnerability, they may opt to exploit the vulnerability. If they're targeting particular users, they may opt for phishing emails. They may opt to send attachments that look like PDF or Word documents, but instead those can be some scripts or some executables that really carry the payload that the attacker wants to execute. For highly targeted attacks, this can be very specific and handcrafted. For example, if they're targeting accounts payable, it could be an invoice, or if they're targeting an executive, it can be made to look as coming from maybe even shareholders or some other high-level business partner, someone who the recipient is usually either expected to trust or even more so follow instructions from. So if someone gets an instruction from their superior saying, hey, can you have a look at this document? They're very likely to open it without thinking too much. And this information about employees and their superiors is usually something you can even harvest from LinkedIn if you look at recommendations and different sorts of information you can find on different people's profile pages on LinkedIn. So how do we stop this? This is really a multi-layered approach. The first thing is visibility. We need to provide visibility into all the traffic, and we can do this using App ID and SSL decryption. App ID will look at network traffic regardless of the port and try to recognize which application is being used based on the patterns of traffic. However, if the traffic is encrypted, the App ID cannot see through encryption. That's the whole purpose of encryption. That said, we do have SSL decryption feature, which we should use to gain visibility into encrypted traffic. Once we have the visibility, we can block the high-risk applications using App ID. And this reduces the attack footprint by quite a bit. If we only allow the applications that need to be allowed, then the attackers cannot really do most of their scans and most of their probes, because they will be limited only to applications that are supposed to be running. If the application is allowed, we can, for example, block malicious or risky websites using URL filtering. That will probably be some malware sites, phishing, hacking, and many different dangerous or risky categories. If there's a file downloaded in question, we can block risky file types using file blocking. This is a fairly, I would say, blunt type of feature where we can block entire file types, but in some cases, this is not possible. So in some cases, we have to allow executables. And I'll get to in a moment what we can do about that. We can block known exploits using vulnerability protection. So vulnerability protection will detect the attempts and will block them if configured so. If the file blocking doesn't block the files, then we can block known malware files using antivirus and WildFire signatures. But this is important. As I mentioned, sometimes we have to allow executables, have to allow scripts, and this is where antivirus and WildFire signatures come into play. They will detect malware in files that were allowed by file blocking. Now, this is known malware, right? So malware for which we have signatures and can detect it and block it. We can block unknown malware using WildFire Inline machine learning. So here we're using machine learning inline on the firewalls to detect malware that we haven't seen before and haven't generated signatures for before. This is very powerful and very important. And then last but not the least, if all these layers are passed, we have WildFire, which will analyze any unknown malware or any unknown file in the cloud, determine if it's malware, benign, or grayware. And then if malware, it will automatically deliver protections globally. So that includes, for example, antivirus and WildFire signatures. That includes updates to the inline ML model. That also includes marking any dangerous URLs with URL filtering and basically helping all other features do their purpose. So if we weren't successful here, the attackers will proceed with the next stage. That's exploitation. So at this point, they were able to establish a connection to a vulnerable server, or they were able to deliver their payload to their target. Now they need to activate that code, that payload that they want to run on the target endpoint. If this is a vulnerability they're trying to exploit, this means they will launch an exploit. If they send an attachment to the recipient via email, for example, they need to make that recipient run that attachment. This can happen in different ways. Again, it could be exploits, it could be scripts with a changed icon or changed extension. Could be also exploits against the email client, or maybe even exploits against the Adobe Reader or some other application, not necessarily the browser and the email client. So in order to prevent this, there's not a whole lot we can do on the network side. So if the attacker is attempting to run code on the endpoint, it means that they've already bypassed all the other protection layers so far. And it's up to the endpoint itself or the user behind the endpoint, whether they will accept the code and run the code or not. What we can do here is we can use Cortex XDR. It is a solution that runs on endpoints and protects endpoints. And it can detect both known and unknown vulnerability exploits. And it also works with WildFire to prevent both known and unknown malware. And this is really important because, as I mentioned, protection will protect against known exploits, but not against the unknown ones. Whereas Cortex XDR is a product that detects patterns that vulnerabilities use and can detect exploitation attempts that haven't been seen in the public before. Again, since this step happens entirely on the endpoint, this is not something we can directly influence with Prisma access. So if we're not successful here and the attacker is, what they will do is they will attempt to establish privilege operations and to establish persistence. Why is this important? Whichever methods they use to get to the endpoint, that might have worked once, they might have tricked the user into opening a document once, or they might have exploited the vulnerability once, but the user will probably be smarter the next time around, or will become more suspicious the next time around, and the vulnerability may be patched with updates, for example, with Windows updates. So they cannot really rely that the method they use to get in is going to work over and over again. This is the reason why they want to make sure that their malware runs even after maybe the user logs off or the service is restarted or even the whole endpoint is restarted. So they will try to copy the code somewhere on the file system and try to make sure that it runs on startup the next time the machine is restarted. In addition to that, they'll try to use a rootkit to hide their tracks, right? So that typically means some sort of a kernel module or a driver that will hide the process that they're running, or it will hide the file they're using on the hard drive. Establishing privileges is also an important step because typically, if it is a server, the service might be running with a non-privileged account. If it is a user, hopefully the user is not an administrator, so will not have a lot of privileges. Whereas if they are able to escalate the privileges to root or administrator level, then they can take control of the full system and possibly harvest some other useful data that normal users don't have access to. For example, a list of other users on the computer, ability to use packet capture on the network interface, ability to send raw packets from the machine, etc., etc. Again, these steps happens entirely on the endpoint, so doesn't really have any network activity. So it's not something that we can protect against with Prisma access. But again, this is where Cortex XDR comes into play. As I mentioned, it can prevent exploitation that leads to privilege escalation or password theft, and also can prevent malware from accessing certain OS functions that typically software wouldn't access or access them in a suspicious way. And again, if a sample of malware is not known, it'll be sent to WildFire for analysis and for creation of additional protections. So if the attacker is successful here, the next thing they do is they try to establish a command and control channel. This is very important because this is where they typically start to work towards their end objectives. They want to know, the first reason is they want to know if their attack was successful. So if their malware reports back to their server, then they know that their code is running on the target machine. And then they can communicate further. So issue new commands to their malware, install additional payloads that will have additional functionality, or even extract data directly back using this channel. But there's a couple of features we can use against command and control. The first one is anti-spyware, which is the feature specifically designed to block command and control communication. We can block the pattern using pattern signatures. We detect patterns inside command and control communication. So we don't rely on domains or on IPs. We look at the patterns, and based on the patterns that we know are used for command and control, we can detect it. Using DNS security and DNS signatures, we can inspect the DNS traffic, and then by using a database of malicious domains, we can make sure that we detect any sort of DNS query towards those domains even before the connection is established and before we can see the patterns of communication. We can use DNS sinkhole feature to redirect the malicious traffic to honeypots so that we can identify and block compromised hosts. I'll stop here for a moment to explain why this is important. If we use anti-spyware, more specifically, if we use the DNS protection features, and we drop the DNS queries, those queries will just simply fail. our SOC teams will be able to see these events in the logs, but in many environments, the source IP of these DNS queries will be corporate DNS servers. And that doesn't really reveal what is the IP or what is the actual endpoint behind this command and control attempt. This is very important because if the machines are attempting command and control, that probably means they have already been infected, that exploitation has already happened. And it's a very, very strong indicator of compromise. And if the source IP here is the DNS server, then we really don't know what is the actual endpoint behind, and the SOC cannot take further action. However, if we use DNS sinkhole, then instead of dropping those DNS queries, we actually send a fake response with a predefined IP. And then we can track connection attempts to that predefined sinkhole IP. And any connect to that sinkhole IP will indicate an infected host. We can also block communications to known malicious URLs using URL filtering, much like in the previous steps. So we have a specific category for that called command and control, but they might be using some other risky ones. Obviously, that works if they're using HTTP type of command and control. Last but not the least, the attackers might be using a protocol that we haven't seen before. Most of them use HTTP or HTTPS because those are very common and commonly allowed towards the internet. But they might be using a completely custom protocol, not even SSL, something that we really know nothing about. In that case, we can use AppID, and with AppID, we can block unknown apps. So if AppID does not recognize an app, it will label it as unknown TCP or unknown UDP. If we block unknown TCP or unknown UDP, we can simply block the traffic that the firewall is not able to recognize. Okay, so if the attacker manages to establish the channel back to their infrastructure, then they actually start to take actions on the objective. Depending on the motivation of the attacker, they can have really different objectives. Most of the times, at least in the last couple of years, the reason or the motivation is money, and the easiest or the best way for the attackers to extract it is using a ransom. Right. So it could be as simple as ransomware, which I'm sure we all know about, which encrypts files and then asks user to pay the ransom before giving the decryption key. But it can also be theft, right? They could steal some very sensitive data, even personal data that's protected by law, and threaten to publish it online, for example. So even without denying access to data, they can ask ransom for different kinds of threats. But that said, it's important to note that ransom or money is not the only reason. There's quite a few nation-state actors which typically want to disrupt businesses and steal information. So ransom might not be the end goal. The end goal might simply be denial of service or theft. So what can we do here? Using file blocking and data filtering or DLP subscription, we can prevent sensitive uploads. For example, you probably wouldn't expect documents, PDFs to go out of the data center towards the internet. And we can use file blocking to fairly effectively detect and block those kind of connections. For a more fine-grained approach, we can use data filtering and DLP, which actually look inside the files and search for sensitive data, and then allow us to apply policies to detect and block such movements of such sensitive data. And then we can also block outbound communication to known malicious URLs using URL filtering, because hackers will frequently use the same methods they use for command and control to tunnel the traffic back to their hosts. One thing that's not covered by the Lockheed Martin kill chain is lateral movement. And this is something that also happens very often. Lateral movement happens when an attacker compromises or gains control of one asset in the network and then moves from that device to other devices in the same network. This is a very logical thing to do from attacker point of view, because typically the hardest layers of protection are on the perimeter. So from the internet to the corporate network or to the cloud these days, typically inside of the corporate network. So for example, from users to users or from users to the data center, The protection is on a much lower level or much lower scale, and it's typically a lot easier to jump from one host inside the network to another than it would be to reach that same host again from the internet using the methods we discussed so far. So it's something that happens fairly often in today's attacks. So how do we prevent this? As I mentioned, the main reason here is that typically companies inherently trust their internal users or their internal endpoints, whether that's laptops or servers. And that's not a good way to go because of many reasons. So one of them is what we've discussed today. The endpoint can get compromised, right? It's a scenario that can happen. On the other hand, we could have insider attacks. We could have disgruntled employees, or we could also have attackers that really go far in trying to penetrate the company and actually try to bribe some of the employees to install malware on their endpoints or on corporate endpoints. There was an example of such a thing with Tesla, for example, in California, where an attacker was offering a bribe to a Tesla employee to install malicious software inside the network. So when that happens, unless we start from a zero trust approach where we don't really trust anyone, and where we inspect traffic and apply the same level of protection, we cannot really protect from these kind of attacks. So once our network is segmented, and once we inspect all the traffic, even the east-west traffic going between trusted zones, then we can apply all these methods that we discussed so far to block and prevent lateral movement as well. Okay, so we've discussed about the attack lifecycle and how we can use different features to break the attack lifecycle, because as you mentioned, breaking at any step will typically deny the attackers of what they were trying to do. So even if they penetrate the system, infect the endpoint, establish a command control channel, if they cannot spread laterally, or if they cannot exfiltrate the data, if they cannot expand their access, then we've still probably done a very good job at protecting them. But simply adopting a feature typically only gives us some visibility. Typically, when companies adopt security features, they'll be very careful or cautious and start with an alert-only mode, which is a great way to gain visibility and should definitely be the starting point. But that only gives us some visibility, sometimes not even complete visibility. What companies want to make sure is to have maximum visibility and maximum protection, because that's the only way to reduce the risk and improve the security posture. Now, obviously, this is easier said than done. Transitioning from visibility to protection is not trivial. So I will discuss some of the recommendations around these best practices. And the recommendations here apply across the Strata portfolio. So the features here are shared with the next generation firewall platform, and what we discuss here applies there as well. So starting with antivirus. In antivirus, we can configure decoders for different protocols and assign different actions to them. The best practice recommendation is to use action reset both for all possible signature types, except for IMAP and POP3. The reason for having a slightly relaxed stance on IMAP and POP3 is simply because of user experience. If a firewall detects a virus in IMAP and POP3, it will simply reset the TCP connection. And to the end user, the IMAP or POP3 client will typically display this as a network error and will retry connection in sort of an endless loop. And to the end user, it's not really clear what's going on. On the other hand, they cannot receive any new emails. Only one email with the virus will block their entire access to email. So this is not always the desired state, but it's one of those trade-offs between user experience and security. In a high-risk environment, it's probably better to apply reset both to IMAP and POP3 as well. When it comes to inline machine learning, there are different machine learning models, and they should be at least enabled in alert mode. Otherwise, no action will be taken on them. And obviously, the recommended action is to activate them in block mode. We don't need packet captures for antivirus, even though that's an option. They're not really useful, so there's no real need unless there's a very specific use case. And it's worth to know that the configuration, the inline machine learning tab will override the per protocol actions in inline ML actions. I know that sounds like a lot of talk, but I have the screenshots here to make it more visual. So as I mentioned, we have different protocols, different decoders for different protocols, and we have different sources of malware information. This would be antivirus, the next one will be WildFire, and then finally WildFire ML. And this is what the recommended settings look like. There's also a separate tab called WildFire Inline ML. And here the different machine learning models can be enabled or disabled. So it's important to enable them here, because if we choose enable, then per protocol actions from the action tab are inherited. If we don't enable them here, then whatever we configured for inline ML on the action tab will take no effect for that particular model. So it's recommended, obviously, to enable all of them. All right, moving on to anti-spyware. So as I mentioned, this feature is designed to block command and control communication. The signature policies are the ones that match patterns inside the traffic. The recommendation here is to, for critical, medium, and high severity signatures, to set the action to reset both and to enable single packet capture. Whereas for informational and low severity, we want to set the default action and disable the packet capture. The default action, it's a bit of a misnomer, but the default action basically means there's a different action, the different default action associated with each signature. This is something that our threat research teams select when they create a signature and when they populate the metadata for the signature. So that means one signature could have a default action of reset both. Another one could have a default action of allow, which just means silently allow without even logging. If we set the default action, that means take the action that's encoded in the signature. And for information and low, that will typically be either silently allow for the most of them, or just alert, so just log. For critical, medium, and high, we recommend setting the action to reset, which means perform reset regardless of what is configured inside the signature itself as the default. Now, this can be a bit of a daunting task. The recommendation here is to always start in alert mode and then monitor the logs. So for example, if we set critical, medium, and high to alert, after some time, we can review the logs, maybe even create some reports and look at all the critical level anti-spyware signatures that trigger. And then we work through the false positives, maybe even open some support cases if some additional insight is needed. And then when we get to a state where we are happy, when all the critical signatures that are firing are really the bad ones, then we can switch the action for critical from alert to reset both. And then we can go to high and repeat the same exercise. The reason, obviously, why we want to start with critical is because those are the ones with the highest impact and with the lowest chance of false positives. So the ones that will give us the most return for the least investment. When it comes to DNS policies, we always recommend that the action is set to sinkhole because of the reasons we discussed. And we recommend single packet capture to be enabled. The packet captures here are important in case of investigation because compared to antivirus, they will typically contain more useful information. So if it's DNS, we'll be able to see the DNS names or the flags of the entire DNS packet. And for the patterns, we might be able to see the patterns of spyware, which can help with investigations. So this is what it looks like in the UI. We can make a single rule for high, critical, and medium with action reset both and single packet capture. And then for low and informational, we can take the default action without packet captures. When it comes to DNS policies, as I mentioned, the recommended action is sinkhole. Okay, Moving on to vulnerability protection, the configuration here is very, very similar to anti-spyware pattern signatures. So again, we have critical, high, and medium recommendation to be set to reset both with single packet capture, and informational and low severity set to default action. The rationale is exactly the same. We want to start with criticals, make sure we're happy with the results, switch that to reset both, and then move down to high, and finally to medium. Informational and low should be kept to default because that typically only logs some of them. And that's very useful because some informational or a lot of informational signatures are really what the severity says, informational. They don't actually represent threats. They might represent normal events, which you probably don't want to even know about or flood the logs with unless there's a specific use case. And this is what it looks like. We can have a single rule for critical, high, and medium with action reset both and single packet capture. And then for low and informational, we set the action to default, which will then vary based on the signature, and we can disable packet captures. When it comes to URL filtering, there's a larger list of categories we recommend being blocked. That's command and control, copyright infringement, dynamic DNS, extremism, malware, phishing, proxy avoidance, anonymizers, unknown, new registered domains, grayware, and parked. The ones in bold, command control, malware, and phishing, these are the three most important ones. These should always be blocked. So without further discussion, and very likely without further testing, this is something that's very safe to be blocked from day one. The other categories are more risk than malware. For example, copyright infringement could be some corporate users trying to download or even share copyright information, such as software or maybe movies or music. And while that might not directly harm the way an attack would, that can still make the corporation liable to lawsuits because their resources were being used to disseminate copyrighted materials. So that's why it's very important to block this. Dynamic DNS, something that is not malicious per se, but it's been used frequently by malicious actors. And on the other hand, very rarely will a corporate user have the need to access a website that's behind the dynamic DNS host. So that's, again, another risk mitigating measure. Extremism, again, by itself, not something that directly affects the network, but these websites are frequently used to disseminate malware, and they can also expose corporations to risk. Proxy avoidance and anonymizers are often used to bypass these controls because it's difficult for firewall or any other security device to understand what the user is actually accessing if they're just accessing a proxy server or some sort of anonymizer website. So because of that, this is recommended to be blocked. Unknown websites. These are websites that our PanDB has not discovered yet. Again, they may be good, they may be bad, but because we don't know what's behind, we recommend those being blocked. Newly registered domains, again, something that hackers use very often. Obviously not bad by itself, but we've seen a lot of campaigns use new registered domains. And again, typically corporate applications will not be on new registered domains. So it's a risk reduction measure to block these. The same goes for grayware and parked. We've seen those used by malware actors, but they don't necessarily have to be malicious. But we've definitely seen malware campaigns using, for example, parked websites for URLs that are just one letter of the actual URL. So they're hoping for users to make a typing mistake when typing a URL to land on their page and think they're on the correct website when they're actually not. For all other categories, we recommend setting action to alert. The purpose of this is to have the logs and to have the information in case any investigation is needed. We recommend to activate credential theft prevention in block mode for sensitive categories and alert for all other categories, which means for some categories where we don't expect or we definitely don't want credentials to be seen, we want to block, and we just want to have information for all the other ones. And last but not the least, credential theft prevention has 3 different modes of operation, and we recommend using the main credential filter mode. And I'll expand that a little bit more when we get to that UI element. So as I mentioned, we recommend blocking the categories that are on the block list. We recommend blocking user credential submission for the sensitive ones, and then using alert for all others. I do want to stop at this example here. For example, very often customers will use a no decrypt custom URL category with websites they want to exclude from decryption. And that's a perfectly valid and a common use case for custom URL categories. However, it's not recommended to set action for these websites to alert. And the reason for this is one of the websites that are excluded from decryption could become a host of malware and could be detected as hosting malware by us. And we could switch the category of that website to malware from, for example, banking or some let's say, benign category. If the action here for custom no decrypt was set to alert, that would take precedence over predefined categories and would not get blocked. Whereas if you set to none, then we'll use the actual PanDB category and take the appropriate action. So have this in mind if you're using custom URL categories for purposes other than URL filtering. So for example, SSL decryption, make sure to use action none for those categories. When it comes to credential detection, as I mentioned, the mode of operation we recommend is the main credential filter. I'll try to summarize this real quick. There are 3 different modes here. One that uses user ID information and only detects usernames of users connected to a particular IP. Another one that uses group mapping information, which can detect any corporate username being used based on the group mapping information. And last but not the least, the domain credential filter, which actually detects corporate passwords being sent out. Now, obviously, it's the only mode that actually protects the passwords, not just the usernames. And with that, it's the most powerful one, which is why it's recommended. It's also the most difficult one to configure because it has prerequisites on the Active Directory side. So there needs to be a read-only domain controller and an extra agent installed there. So it's not so trivial to implement like user and group mapping mode, but it's definitely the most powerful one and recommended for the reason of protecting the actual password. Okay, for file blocking, we recommend blocking risky file types and alerting on all others. Risky file types would be different types of archives like 7-zip, RAR, CAB, and TAR, because the firewall does not inspect those directly. The script file types, because most often, especially for example in email, they're used for malicious purposes and almost never transferred over those channels for good purpose. Then also executables, and then not just Windows executables, but different types of class like Java executables or jar, which would be Java archives typically containing executables, and all these other Windows, either modern or old executable types. For the other types, torrent, because typically that's not something we want in a corporate environment. The Microsoft file types such as HTA, CHM, and HLP, which usually have some sort of executable privileges. Flash, because of a lot of vulnerabilities that Flash has had over the years. It's been deprecated by most browsers today, so it's perfectly safe to block. MSI, again, for mostly the same reasons as executables, because it typically carries executables. And then something special called multi-level encoding. And I'll zoom in on that just a little bit. The firewall is able to parse different encodings in Prisma Access and in NGFW as well. That could be a base64 decoding or gzip decoding, or even looking into zip files. But there is a certain depth until which the firewall can go. After that, it does not have the resource to do that for every session, and it's limited by software or hardware. Once that happens, a virtual file type triggers called multi-level encoding. When that triggers, that means the firewall would have to decode more than it can. And it basically means it cannot inspect that particular file anymore. And this is something that we obviously recommend being blocked. So if we cannot expect it anymore, then we should block it. Last but not the least, we recommend blocking encrypted file types, such as encrypted RAR and encrypted zip, because if they're encrypted, it means neither the firewall nor WildFire can look inside them and cannot really determine if there's something good or bad inside. Now, this is the general recommendation, but I also want to say this is not something you can just apply to all the policies. In most cases, you would probably block some sensitive traffic, such as Windows updates or maybe SCCM software deployments. So this has to be used with caution. It's a very powerful tool for reducing the attack surface. As I mentioned, for example, if you block all the scripts, all the executables, and the encrypted file types in email, the attack surface for email is reduced quite a bit. That's a place where we would never expect to see these kind of file types. And that's the place where these kind of file types are often used to deliver malware. Whereas in some other channels, for example, as I mentioned, for Windows updates or SCCM or any sort of MDM, this could have a reverse effect of blocking actual business traffic. So it's a very powerful feature, but before just applying this recommendation and blocking all the dangerous file types, some planning needs to be involved, and it needs to be applied on places where it won't cause any issues. This is what it looks like. So we block the risky file types. We can choose the direction, upload or download. The recommendation is both. And then we also block the encrypted ones. And for the other file types, we set them to alert, much in line with the recommendation for all other alerts, which is for visibility. Last but not the least, WildFire is very simple in terms of configuration and in terms of configuration. We want all the applications for all the file types, for all the directions to be configured to upload to public cloud. And that's what it looks like, really, really simple. Some of the reasons why this may not be possible could be some sort of regulation where we would not want the file sent to the public cloud, but typically in Prisma Access, that's not an issue because we're already in the cloud, the enterprise is in the cloud, the firewalls are in the cloud, so analyzing the files further in the cloud is typically not a problem. And that's why in Prisma Access, it's really simple. Just configure a rule that forwards all the files from all the applications in all the directions, which means upload and download, to the public WildFire cloud for analysis. All right, time for Q&A.